So, once again, Griffin, on human rights. Still chapter 3. We're on section 3.5 now. A proposal and a qualification. Note I put a little alpha and a little beta. So the proposal is down here, basically a big practical turn in ethics, and the qualification is namely that it's going to have limitation. Human limitation is part of the story. So how does he get there? So that's what I want to talk about in this video, is how Griffin gets to this why we should have this highly practical turn and taking into account human limitation. So once we get to the stage of like this level, this stage of understanding the value of human rights, we see that it can come in degrees, right? So it's not just that human rights are absolute. They can be traded off. We're not flippant or cavalier about how we do it. They're serious things, right? This is something that we highly value. And remember, valuing has to be unpacked. It can be deontologically unpacked in terms of instantiating and the right is independent of the good. Or you can say, no, I value things via promoting is valuing, and if instantiating best promotes, then I instantiate. But if valuing means that I may not actually instantiate, I'm going to promote. But my primary concept here is promoting. So Griffin's in the promoting camp. Don't forget that. So it makes sense to talk about value coming in degrees, and you can promote in degrees or whatnot. Whereas the deontological position, aside from that little bit I included on W.D. Ross, really doesn't have that kind of flexibility. So there are situations in which you're going to have human rights having more value, like human right 1 having more value than human right 2. You're going to need a bridging notion. Remember, I talked about when you're comparing and contrasting apples and pineapples, which one weighs more. You can compare and contrast with shape or whatever, but you have a bridging notion. What do they have in common such that, one has more of that common element or less than? Well, weight. Pineapple probably has more of the common element weight than an apple does. That's how you can compare them. And you could also generate contrasts with that as well. So you need some kind of bridging concept with human rights. Well, that's going to be personhood. We've seen that. That's what, which one promotes, which human right is a better protector and promoter of personhood. Okay. We've also seen clashes with human rights and non-human rights, but moral considerations. Previously talked about the clash between a human right and a welfare concern, which is a moral concern, but it's not necessarily a human rights concern. Again, remember, Griffin doesn't think every moral that the domain of morality is coextensive with human rights, right? But nonetheless, even if you push that line, he would still say you have conflicts anyways, because you have conflicts between human rights. So human rights have more value or maybe less than non-human right moral consideration. You need a bridging notion. And he says, well, maybe importance to life or whatever. So, was it when the previous one, remember the state, no time to consult. Well, how important is it to my life if I'm living along, doing my thing, and the government says, oh, we got to go help the state, you got to spend a lot of your cash to help that other state. That's no big deal, I might say. Yeah, it kind of violates, but it's not that important to my life. But it's extremely important to those lives over there. Go ahead and do it, even though you're violating my human rights. So that's your bridging notion, could be an importance to life. So anyways, these are more sort of kind of, housekeeping, shall we say, structural, logical features of these arguments, that we have bridging notions and we can talk about value of human rights coming in degrees. Now, here we've seen that he's pushed away, or he's trying to distance himself from the Kantian thing. So now he wants to distance himself from consequentialism. He wants a teleological view, but he doesn't want to be trapped, as he says, in this consequentialist. And he's saying, like, if we start with bridging notions and all that, are we going down the path to consequentialism? And he wants to say, no, not necessarily. So he doesn't want to be consequentialist. So remember, the heart, just as a little thing here, the heart of normative ethics is the fundamental distinction between deontology and teleology. He's pushed him away. Get away from me, deontology, says Griffin, and come to me, teleology. But teleology says sure, but he brings along consequentialism and virtue ethics and whatnot. And so what he wants to do is kind of go down, and it's kind of hard to read here, but so there's virtue ethics, and then there's something under which I did with a little question mark here, something that's not quite virtue ethics, but not consequentialism, but it's closer to virtue ethics than consequentialism. So he's kind of wants to this kind of quasi-Aristotelian thing, I would say, because he does want to line up, he does talk a little bit, and I even wrote it here, a little bit like Aristotle, right? Man, all roads lead to Aristotle. Maybe that's just a fact. So, rejects deontology, now criticizes consequentialism. Well, consequentialism, if you're familiar with that, act and rule, we've all heard that. Consequentialism is like a nightmare, a welter of put it this way, consequentialism writ large is just a family of all kinds of theories of consequentialism. Utilitarianism is one form. It's a maximizing form, but there's other ones. You can be a consequentialist without being a utilitarian and whatnot. So consequentialism is like a giant genus. Utilitarianism is one species, and there are subspecies of utilitarianism. There's tons. It's just ramified and like crazy. So it's like a giant tree, right? Consequentialism, when it goes out in all kinds of branches, and all very interesting. Arguably, probably the biggest sort of most developed genus of theories that of moral theories. You probably make that argument, but anyways, I'm not too wed to that. But certainly a big one. But he's trying to push it all away. So can he do it? Well, you know, he's doing it very quickly. Whether or not he gets a good whether it's a great job is another question. So act and rule. Act consequentialism or act utilitarianism really is, you know, you're judging the act is the foundational element, and the consequences of the act are what you look at. So the consequentialism in this framework looks at acts and individual acts, and of course, you know, those you get into, you know, the torchlit mob at night problem and all that. So if you're not familiar with that, you should have a look at that literature. There's tons of that stuff on the problems with act. And some philosophers argue that ultimately this distinction really can be, you know, if you argue enough, you can chew this distinction up. It's what John Dewey may have been referring to when he called distinctions are philosopher's toys. Sometimes they don't really hold up. Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We make lots of distinctions that work in practice. Scientists make tons of distinctions. You know, when you think about making distinctions in what you're going to study, nobody studies the universe. People study parts of it, but maybe the universe as a whole. So making distinctions is not necessarily bad. It is the way we often get a lot of knowledge. But in any case, he is more inclined to look seriously, accepting this distinction. This one's kind of written off. Rule consequentialism, which Griffin uses the term indirect consequentialism, which I'll just take as being another term for rule consequentialism, is now you're not looking at acts, you're looking at the consequences of rules, right? So, you know, you might say, well, you know, what's the difference? Well, you look at kind of the way social reformers do, legal theorists, lawyers, judges, etc., politicians, when they put a policy in place, like a set of rules, they'll look at, well, okay, is it better to have those rules or not? Or what are the consequences of putting those rules in place? And so it's the results, the consequences, and the results of rules, that not individual acts. Again, some philosophers would say that when you really chew away at this distinction kind of collapses. But nonetheless, indirect or rule consequentialism is something that he looks at. Now, he looks at it arguably from the perspective of a virtue theorist, and by concentrating on the human subject. And he says this is a really important thing in ethics, that, you know, you really have to look at the nature of who's doing the calculating, and, you know, because it has to be done, right? It's not like Mill. Yes, you can point to places where Mill says, well, okay, you're not running around calculating all the time. Mill thought that, he did say, well, there are kind of rules of thumb. So, utilitarianism isn't actually an ongoing, in the moment decision procedure where you're going to be like, oh, before I do anything, just a minute, give me a while to calculate all of it. No, he didn't think that. He thought more after the fact that you would be doing that, and then you would get these rules of thumb, so you would live as a utilitarian, but they would be more like patterns of behavior. That sounds a little bit like Aristotle. Mill admired Aristotle deeply. So he thought that you would use utilitarian sort of reasoning to construct a kind of character that would be a good moral character, a virtuous character, but it would be constructed sort of out of utilitarian type ways of viewing the world. But you don't necessarily walk around calculating all the time. So, but, Griffin's saying, how good are we at this of calculation, right? We just think that, calculating, we're just not going to get the kinds of results that are going to enable us to really make these decisions. So he says, look, we're really good with some kinds of calculations, extremes, in this sense. We can we can calculate extremes like, like think about possible worlds. The actual world now that we have, let's say if you're living in a liberal democracy, and a possible world of as contrasted with what you're living in. So you're living in a certain society that's pretty stable and it's law governed and all that. And then I say, well, what about living in contrasting that with some idealized catastrophe of a lawless society? What about that? Well, Griffin says we're not bad at that. We're pretty good at these heavily idealized ones, either terrible possibilities or absolutely wonderful possibilities. We're good at that. And if you look at the way that people who do the metaphysics of propositions via possible worlds, there are different separations of worlds when you talk about possible worlds. So possible worlds that are very separated, quite different than the one we're in, we're pretty good at dealing with that, right? Sure, like a lawless world versus a law-governed world. But what about possible worlds that are not that different? And he gives an example here about today's world with one world with a possible world where, let's say, doctors, physicians have slightly less respect for human life. And so he says, they kill a couple patients off maybe a little bit quicker and whatever, and it saves on some resources so they can help more patients that have a better chance, right? So just something that you just tweak it a little bit. So as the possible worlds theorists would say, a possible world that's very close, approximate possible world. Are we good at calculating those consequences? And Griffin says, no, not really. We're not that good at that. But that's kind of what we live in. We don't live in these crazy sort of, highly different possibilities. We live in ones that are quite close. So that is, we're living in an actual world, and what we have to consider are possibilities that are quite close to what we have. We're not that great at that, and in that sense. He changes his conversation. He says, we're not good with contrasting live options. We're good with contrasting extremes, like a live option and some extreme, but not really two live options where you say one's the actual one and that's living, of course, but another living option would be something that's not that different, just a slight change. That contrast of living options, that gives us a lot more grief. We're not that good with that. Now, well, he said that we might not like these kinds of these slightly different possible worlds, but how could we block it just on consequentialist grounds, right? So there's been lots of criticism of consequentialism in this way. Derek Parfit does that, where certain kinds of maximizing things could lead to, very unacceptable, repugnant conclusions that would be difficult to avoid on purely consequentialist grounds. And remember, you're supposed to be faithful to your theory, right? If you're saying I'm looking at it from a consequentialist perspective, and it leads you to something you would maybe reject intuitively, well, you can't just say, I'm a consequentialist and I reject it, because you're not being a consequentialist anymore if you reject it on non-consequential grounds. So he's saying that basically consequentialism is something itself that is problematic, and it's something that really doesn't take account of sort of the individual. And that's a long-standing criticism of utilitarian and consequentialism, is it doesn't, Rawls has criticisms of this from a deontological angle, that consequentialism doesn't really distinguish and differentiate amongst persons. It tends to aggregate things too much in ways that we will find unacceptable. Now, this raises, this is an important one. It raises another important one of the nature of the agent in ethics, right? So this is a big problem, he thinks, that we don't really talk about. So the very nature of the agent shapes the kind of ethics that we can realistically have, right? And think about it. You know, this is a law. This is a logical law in deontic logic that ought implies can, right? You hear this a lot from Kant, but it goes back to Aristotle. He's got it in his reasoning too, in the Nicomachean Ethics, that you know the things that you're held responsible for are and the things that you should rationally wish and desire, like with the rational ones, are things that you could do, that are possible. So if it's something that you ought to do, then it's necessarily, ought implies can, it's necessarily the case that it's something that you can do. So if I ought to give $5 to charity, well, that ought can only make sense, according to this law, if I can do it, right? If there's a charity to give to and I have the money. If I had no charity to give to, and also, so it would be impossible for me to donate $5, or if I didn't have $5, if I couldn't do it, well, then it doesn't make sense to say I ought to do it, right? So ought implies can. Well, that also can be reflected not just in physical situations where I gave the existence of a charity, the existence of a bank account with more than $5 or at least $5. What about ones that demand things that people can't do, right? That where morality would be at the point where people just couldn't live up to it. So, you know, like here's, you know, the sinking ship example, right? You know, if I'm on a sinking ship, Griffin says, you know, something along these lines that you know, a theory might say that I should treat all children equally, right? But my kid might be amongst them. So I would probably find it very difficult to prioritize other children over my own, right? I just couldn't do it, right? And Griffin would say, well, yeah, it might be asking too much of humans to do that. So there are limitations of what humans not only can physically do, but psychologically. You might be demanding too much out of people. So, and also, where is this unavoidable sort of favoritism coming from? Is it purely psychological, or could you even generate some sort of moral argument in favor of it? So you can have a look at Griffin's discussion, but the upshot of it is that he thinks that motivation, you know, is an important thing to think about in ethics. He thinks that, you know, that if we talk about, you know, trying to increase motivation through a certain kind of ethics, you might get a kind of exciting ethics, but it might not be attainable. Ones that are attainable may not deliver very much in the end. So nonetheless, motivation is an important thing to think about. But whether or not that's the true answer is not something that's entirely clear. Now, later on, again, this is a very rich section, and I'm certainly not going to all the details of it. But Griffin, you know, talks a little bit about Aristotle. And he wants to step back and say, look, I'm just starting to sketch this this teleological, non-consequentialist view of normative ethics. Well, again, if you've got a teleological, non-consequentialist, that's going to force you down into this zone here. So if that's the route that he's taking, well, it's not surprised that Aristotle. Do all roads lead to Aristotle, as I asked? Maybe. But Aristotle's main concern in his teleology, of course, was with the notion of happiness, right? And so being virtuous also, Aristotle was very clear, will not always look the same, even in a given situation for everyone, because it's also dependent on the individual as well. So it's a very much, making decisions. It's not mathematical. It's not really even a theory. So virtue ethics is not a theory in the way, say, Mill's utilitarian or Kant is. Okay, so in this sense, for teleological ethics for Aristotle, yeah, the only values really used in deriving moral principles are the ends of human life, the goals, right? Happiness. Whereas Griffin thinks there's more going on, and so practicalities will be involved. So it's a kind of Aristotelian teleological, but broader than Aristotle's view. Now, once we take the practicalities into account, it may not be entirely clear what policy to set. So he admits, it's not going to give us an easy and clear answer. But we must steer clear of that, what he calls the Newtonian halo, that blinds us to think we're going to get a Newtonian-like theory of ethics that Kant and Mill were thinking you could get. You're just not going to get that. And so you have to have this, what he proposes is this practical, a highly practical turn in ethics, and one that's going to have to look at human limitations, right? This is not a new approach. This is one that lawyers and legal theorists and politicians have been doing for years. This is, again, this is the old Enlightenment tradition of a more practical view, building in human and common sense notions into our thinking. So that's going to be part of it. And he says we're going to have to look at things from a more common sense point of view. And not being always rising to a high level of abstraction. So a common sense, highly practical turn is what Griffin is advising us to take.